Now, I want to address the issue today within the context of the year of faith, the issue of the object of the exercise, to put it crudely. I've just come back from retreat, an international retreat in Fatima, and the conferences were all very faithful to the magisterium, which is a great blessing nowadays because you know you've been well fed. But they were all on this level of the battle, because we find ourselves, as long as we're on earth, involved in a crossfire, and it's not therefore a joke. The game of life, even though it has to be enjoyed, is deadly serious. And Thomas Merton, in one passage, has that well put, to the effect that the monastic life is serious. People are asked to be victims on earth because life is serious. And it is a game of the enemy of the soul to make people travel through life as though it were basically a game to be enjoyed, no matter what the consequences are. Now, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is the bottom line with regard to the year of faith. How to handle it depends on how one's relationship with the Lord is based, because some people need a lot of words, a lot of reading to be fed. Others can go before the Blessed Sacrament and be quietly ministered to the Lord by just one word which inflames the heart. In that context, there's a difference between Lectio Divina, where it is affective, based on being warmed by a word and stopping, and theological study, or even actually spiritual reading. Now, spiritual reading is something which one tends to do also with a certain quantity. One actually does study an author, as in theology one has to study a Tractatus and get all the elements. Or nowadays it tends to happen quite a lot in listening to a tape or a CD or watching a DVD, the modern books. Hence the use of them, and the Holy Father would want this, that we actually get into that rather than let the enemy have the field day himself. But the faith is, all of it, based in this fundamental optic of the big issue. We are in a mess. It boils down to that. And therefore we're all, from the moment of our conception, at a risk of falling into the place where the enemy of the soul wants us. That's what it's all about, and very few actually speak about it plainly, but it's very serious stuff. Now, that was coming out very clearly in this week of spiritual exercises in Fatima. I want to speak about a few issues. First of all, the way in which the whole of the Catechism, in a sense, is a placing of the remedy of that, which is the Church and all that the Church offers as a means, so that we actually are on the winning side and get there. It's all about that. And one very powerful remark which was made to us towards the end of the spiritual exercise, actually by the President of the Episcopal Conference of the Philippines, Archbishop Palma, he put it this way: all that we're up to is in vain if we don't get there. In other words, all the work that we do in pastoral ministry, in the contemplative life, in handling individuals, has to be understood in that optic, that every soul that comes to me, or every soul that is around me, has to be got there. Therefore, any word we say to a person has to help in that direction. And a word can. A word can change eternity. Now, the structure of the Catechism is therefore based, as you know, on different sequences, yes, e.g. the Articles of the Creed, the Ten Commandments, the Sacraments, and so on. But globally, it's all about getting our armour, our artillery, all that we have analysing therefore essentially what we believe and the means that we have, categorically and in the sections under study. Now, to understand therefore what we're at, we need to go back for a second to what I attacked last time. The question of the difference between ourselves as Catholics and, first of all, our brethren by blood, as it were, the Eastern rites, Christians who have the sacraments, and these others. Now, a document which helps us to understand that is the document Lumen Gentium, which is the dogmatic constitution on the nature of the Church. It's not quite the same in type as Gaudium et Spes, which is about the modern Church, or the Church in modern times, how therefore it dialogues. The other is of the essence of the Church. Therefore, it is actually, despite the fact that we talk about Vatican II as a pastoral council, a dogmatic issue. The nature of the Church, how we understand it. There can be no discontinuity or change. Therefore, we have always to remember what has gone before, e.g., the fact that it was proclaimed by Urban VIII, or Boniface VIII, in Unam Sanctam, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the Church there is no salvation. Now remember, these are proclamations which have formed the mindset of Catholics over the years. Therefore, we have to always to understand that there is a continuity in certain things. Now, what does that mean? We have to understand it from within the magisterium of the Church. The famous case of a certain Father Feeney in the late 40s in the States, in the area of New York, if I remember correctly. He was publicly proclaiming and preaching that the interpretation of that was to be taken literally. Now, interestingly enough, because he was a good preacher, he had a great influence, and it was being picked up by the authorities, and it was referred to the Congregation of Rites, the present Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. And it was studied there because it could not be allowed to pass at that point unobserved because of its implications in the realm of dialogue and so on. And a responsus came back to the ordinary of that area, it would have been the Archbishop or Cardinal Archbishop of the area, which actually disciplined him. And remember, the way of disciplining in the years preceding the council were quite strong. It was fairly heavy artillery. He was actually, I think, excommunicated. He was put certainly in a strong situation of discipline and correction. But do you see what's going on there? It's a very important case because itself, the magisterium, is interpreting itself. It's always the same truth, but the authentic interpretation. Therefore, even before the council, there is this understanding of what our faith means in a profound element of dialogue. And by the way, that is one of the great differences that one finds, that one feels in the air, between dialogue, for instance, among the different sects and even denominations of non-Catholics, and the Catholic Church. There is a serene internal dialogue, and by people who know all the elements, Jesuits, Benedictines, Dominicans, people who have given all their life to study, and therefore know all the elements of an equation. And Rome, of course, takes them on board. It is very slow to speak, but when it does, says what has to be said, and no more. Compare that with the way that, for instance, our separated brethren, even amongst themselves, insist on parts of a truth out of context, cannot agree amongst themselves, let alone with us. It's bound to be the case. And not only that, but the way in which they do so is extremely interesting. Why does one have to raise one's voice? It's a bad sign. Now, this then is an indication of the way that the Spirit himself was leading us to understand our faith. Now, Lumen Gentium, therefore, is the result of a profound interior analysis and discussion and meditation on the question of salvation and how it works. In simple terms, Lumen Gentium goes into it in this way. It talks about the way in which the true church, remember the truth is one, and the design of the Lord is one. He founded a church. The fullness, the truth of the church, the one true church, subsists, that's the Latin formula that is used in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, do you see how that short expression contains many, many things? This subsisting in means that there is actually a visible church. It's not just exactly an invisible and virtual quantity. There is more to it. The structure is actually divine in origin and will. The Lord founded and willed. He created himself the structure. How? By himself handing on his own authority and configuring certain people to himself. The apostles were to carry on. And therefore the bishopric, the actual structure, the hierarchical structure, already clearly in place as early as St. Ignatius of Antioch, is of divine origin. Now, there is therefore the will to have the structure that we know and only we know, where Peter is present and central. Because say what you like, you can't bypass the issue. It was from the beginning, and it was understood from the beginning in that way. And there is an internal clarity actually in the Gospels themselves. Look at the writings, how they, the Semitic writers themselves, those who are in the early group, use not actually quite often the name Peter, but Cephas, Kephas. Therefore they are using the word the Lord used. St. Paul himself uses the word Kephas, the Aramaic for rock. That means that is the language they had, they got it from the Lord, and it means the Lord himself gave that name. And we find actually the name Simon or Simeon coming in the Acts of the Apostles, for instance, in the Council of Jerusalem. We found James, I think, coming out with this, as Simeon has spoken. There's a reference to Simeon being used by James, who of course is of that band. He is a Semite, he's using the Semitic form of the word Simon. And the fact that the Lord himself imprinted this word, Kephas, coming through as Peter, Petros, and that it was understood as such, the power of the keys and the centrality of Peter, and even amongst the apostolic band, it's clear that they themselves weren't happy about it. The proof that we have these two brothers, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, coming up and either themselves or their mother actually pushing behind them. Because why? They had already that intuition that Peter was in the first place. And therefore there's already there this human dynamics, and it's still in the church. We can't bear that. We want to be having the first place. Therefore, as early as the apostolic election, we've got that there. The primacy is there. Therefore, the structure is from the very first place there, and you can't get away from it. Therefore, take away that central point, as our brethren in the East are doing in practice since the split. You can't, therefore, in that situation, have a right to that expression subsisted. It subsists in. There is something missing. Now, as I said last time, it does not mean that we haven't got there the fullness of sacramental life, but it does have a problem with regard to the magisterium. They can't have the fullness of the magisterium. Proof. When it comes to the self-understanding of the church with the later proclamations, e.g., one fairly close to us, 1950 isn't that long ago, when Pius XII proclaimed that Our Lady was assumed, therefore not proclaiming a new dogma, but actually crystallizing what was there, having consulted all the bishops of the world. And it's, of course, in the East as well, although they tend not to put things down in the same way as we do, but the faith is there. They tend to talk about the Dormition in the East. Yes. They don't actually define what actually happened, but it's there mystically. What they don't do, as we do, is put things down in print in the same way. Now, also the Immaculate Conception, also papal infallibility, these things which were proclaimed after the separation, they can't have that. Therefore, they have what they had when they went, 1054, and it's there. That, of course, kept them alive in persecution. In communist times, they only had the possibility of the cult. They could not preach very much or hardly at all, but they could worship, and it was there, their theology, in the very rich liturgy, lex orandi. Now, with regard then to what is happening, this doctrine of the necessity of the Church comes down to, I put it in simplistic terms, a doctrine in Lumen Gentium of concentric circles. We have what the Lord willed, Peter and the apostles in communion with him. Yes. And remember, by the way, that in 1870 we had the First Vatican Council who attacked this question of the infallibility. But what happened? It was brought to a rather quick close because there was political pressure. It was very uncomfortable. Things were going on in Europe at the time, the Franco-Prussian War. Essentially, they had to stop things at that point. And the other element, which was balanced out in Vatican II, of collegiality, was not even attacked. There was no time, and they didn't actually go into the fullness of the nuances which could have been developed, because the whole structure of the Church is extremely complex and rich. It was in Vatican II. And by the way, the reason why the first document to be formed and discussed and published was the one on the liturgy, Sacro Sacrum Concilium, was because they had the intuition that the real problem was going to be not there, but with the one that would attack the structure of the Church. It was essentially Christus Dominus, the one that discussed the bishops, also Lumen Gentium. They were dogmatic constitutions, those. And they thought, because of what I'm saying with regard to Vatican I, and the whole ethos of theology at the time, although it was developing in its way of handling things, they could foresee a huge problem in discussing this and getting it down on paper, because there were several tendencies. And of course the theologian had also a certain power. And Ratzinger, of course, was an expert in those days, a peritus. He was not yet a bishop, but a very forward-looking and complete theologian. Now, the issue then had to be discussed. Sacro Sacrum Concilium was done, and it did not enter into the details. It gives a broad outline of what renewal and application and aggiornamento are about within what is received. It was handed over to the Commission to handle how that will be put in practice, and that is another question which perhaps I could go to eventually as well. But I want to get into the question of the Church. In Lumen Gentium, it goes into the question, remember where we're coming from, that we're all in a mess. We need salvation. What is the means? Well, it defines the Church itself as the means, the sacrament of the unity of the human race, the sacrament of the salvation of the human race, the sacrament which in itself is the bridge, the means by which we're plugged into Calvary, without which no one can be saved. Remember, no one can be saved without the blood of the cross. The issue is there. Until the Lord said, "It is consummated," the doors of paradise were firmly locked. No one could get in, not even the just of the Old Testament. It was at that point when he breathed his last, in complete control of the situation, he handed over his spirit in command as a majestic king. At that point, it was accomplished. And what happened? The old regime physically was broken by the veil of the temple being torn apart from top to bottom. That, by the way, is also interesting. It's probably a reference to the fact that even the way it was done, it should not have been that way, but the other way it had to tear it apart at all. So anyway, the Lord was ripping it apart. And we have in the intuitions and visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich how that was a very interesting thing, because afterwards the priests were trying to carry on their thing, and it was a very strange affair. Nothing would work, and it was all dark, and it was strange, it was all different.
Yes.
But that's another question again. The intuitions and the mystics help us to understand how dramatic it was. And of course you had these bodies getting up from the graves and so on, the just. It's in the Gospel. It was a huge cosmic event, even at the death of the Lord.
Yes.
And so anyway, down he went. And if one sees the film of Mel Gibson, one sees that the departures of the souls at Calvary. The Lord, of course, is victorious. And of course, having said, first of all, that today you'll be with me in paradise. And he's okay. And the death of that one is a wonderful event as well. But the other one, of course, who refuses grace, the same torment, goes the other way. And that showed very well in Mel Gibson. It would seem he did not make it. And it is very dramatic, actually, that point. And by the way, you know that in the Eastern Church, that is represented even in the cross. If you look at an Eastern church, it has kind of onion affair at the top, doesn't it? And then it has a cross, which in the Greek church is like that. And then you've got the top thing, which represents the accusation, Inri, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum. And then underneath you've got the bottom bar on which the feet are thought to be resting, but then it remains like that, and it's that way, flat. But if you go to the Russian church, I believe, one of the bars is pointing down. It is diagonal at the bottom of the cross. And that is representing the one who made it, going up, and the one who didn't make it, going down on either side of the Lord. But implying that it's the crux, crux means cross, of all, that it's all decided by Calvary and on Calvary and our response to Calvary. But Calvary! No one gets there without Calvary. Now that's kind of important stuff. So it's defining already for us embryonically the nature of the church. The church is what gets us there, because there is flowing the means of grace. It is there that the Lord is giving himself, because the church is the perpetuation of the incarnation and of the ongoing redemption. Why? He has given to the church the extension of Calvary until the end of time. It's not just a club. Calvary goes on. The salvific will of the Lord is present until the end of time. When he gave the priesthood to mankind in the upper room, he was giving it in the context of giving also his body and blood and the perpetuation of the power of that cross. Because in the very words of institution, it's there. Quod pro vobis tradetur, which will be given up for you. The sacrificial element is there. And in the blood, effundetur, poured out, pro vobis et pro multis, for you and for many, therefore implying that there has to be also a participation in the entering into that. It's not automatic. That's why right now we're getting back to the correct reading of it, which is actually what the Lord himself, we have no right to change what the Lord said. For many, not for all. He said for many. There's a reason why he said that. It's a Semitic way of saying for the great multitude, and therefore implication is, yes, for any who wish, but it's not just automatic, and that's a misconception. There's a part to be played, and if it's not played, we're in a mess still. And that's actually a misrepresentation even of the modern day devotion of the Divine Mercy. It's handled in an imbalanced way, because the Divine Mercy has no sense if we're not still potentially in a mess. To give the impression that the Lord is so merciful that no one can ever be lost is completely misleading. And it's the reverse of what the whole doctrine of St. Faustina was altogether, because she has always the two in perfect equilibrium, justice and mercy. Mercy has no sense if there is no justice. We're in a mess, that's the bottom line. Therefore, now, what Lumen Gentium goes into is this, basically. The fullness of the means are there when we are in that situation of coherence with what the Lord actually wanted and did, the structure, and therefore in union with Peter, the one doctrine, which from the beginning was there. We find it already in the Acts, right at the beginning, one heart and one mind, in the breaking of bread and the teaching of the apostles, therefore, and we find the consultation going on. Paul is a bit worried, have I got this right? He consults the columns of the church. We find also, I think it's in one of the epistles to Timothy, the church referred to as the column, the pillar of truth. Yeah. Therefore, that's been picked up by Scott Hand, by the way, the fact that even in the apostolic writings, you've got the fact the church is there as the pillar, and it has to be there. But Peter does consult the others, Peter and James and so on, they do, and we have the church itself in the 15th chapter of the Acts, itself And it's a very interesting formula, because after they say, it has pleased the Holy Spirit and us. Very interesting order of words. In other words, they're identifying their union, their collegiality. We know that the Holy Spirit is with us when we're all together. And then that was the way they handled this question of how to handle these non-Jews. Do they have to be circumcised and all the rest of it? They have to have all these observances, and they didn't. So, because precisely Calvary was doing it for us, and the rest was a prefiguration, a type. Now, okay, that then gets us into what the Lord has given in its fullness, and therefore we can be sure that if we follow what precisely is in the Catechism with regard to the doctrine and the means, we're going to be okay, because that's what being in the bark, the Noah's Ark, the ship of the church, implies, that we're actually safe from the waves if we follow all, not just bits of. And that's the danger, because you can't presume that I'm a Catholic and therefore I'll make it, because being a cafeteria Catholic is not enough. And that's what's going on now. People are living in sin and still going to church on a Sunday and receiving Holy Communion, but they're living in sin in the meantime. It's not necessarily going to work. It's actually presuming, and it's actually being in charge, us, of our thing. Yes. We can have as much spirituality as we want, but if we're not obeying, we're doing our own thing. And it's linked precisely with the lack of faith and correct teaching. Therefore, this era of faith is something objective, concrete, and much needed, because people are actually at a risk, even though they might be in the Catholic Church, physically. Because being in the Catholic Church goes to a different level, and that's what I want to get to now. This element, then, of concentric circles, the Council goes into it like this. It refers to those who are Christian. Of course, the whole issue of the East comes into a separate document anyway. It goes into the Oriental churches, a document apart. But they are really our brothers, most intimate brothers. You've got, then, those who are essentially in the West, those who in Europe, of course it went over to America and other countries afterwards, but it started there. The division, the revolution essentially, that happened in the 1500s, started about 1521 or so, and you had Luther making these declarations. But his idea was not to separate initially, but he sort of went further and further away as time went on. And actually in studies his writings, how they become quite polemic eventually, whereas before, in the beginning, they're much calmer, and he has beautiful things to say about Our Blessed Lady, Luther. You wouldn't think that, but then of course he changes tune. Anyway, you've got then, therefore, this immediate circle, our brethren, the Protestants. Now, what's going on there? All the language of Lumen Gentium is extremely charitable and divine. The kind of language the Lord would use. And all the words used of these different sectors, then, are as though it were the Lord's embrace to these. Because remember, he's on side. He's always trying to help and save. He does not want to see one bit of his creation lost. Therefore he's doing all he can. And that's the way the Council is more or less saying, look, how does it work for these? Now, there are certain basic, unchanging principles, always based on the Lord's teaching anyway. I am the way, the truth and the life. No one can come to the Father but by me. Therefore Calvary has to be the means of getting there. But the application of the precious blood, the application of the merits, the application of the sacrifice can come to a soul who is looking towards Calvary, towards Christ for salvation, and unbeknown to itself is therefore gravitating mystically towards also the fullness of means, which is the Catholic Church. Because going towards Christ, going towards the Sacred Heart, going towards the love of the Redeemer as a friend, means automatically going towards the other brethren who are doing the same thing, and to the will of Christ, which, if understood, would lead to that. But it's not always understood. Therefore, the whole issue of good faith is extremely important, because a child being born into, for instance, an evangelical family, a Baptist family or whatever, will follow in the early years what it's taught in Sunday school, and it's of good faith. It's not responsible for its errors. But if later on a problem comes, it's not the same. I remember actually when I was about 13, our Sunday school teacher, because I was a Baptist, and our Sunday school teacher, still alive actually, he was a man of great value. he actually became a judge and a person of great importance. But he was very insistent in those crucial years when he was forming us that we would know the whole story and not become bigots.
Yes.
He would take us everywhere. Places of history in Welsh spirituality where things had happened, but also other churches, synagogues, Catholic churches, Orthodox churches, Quakers, the whole lot. He would take us himself and want us to experience everything. And I remember one time, when still a pretty anti-Catholic Protestant, he was getting us to make this play. It was the translation of the Bible by St. Jerome, how the Bible came to us from the Apostles, basically, but in theatrical form. And they put out the lights and so on, and going in procession and so on. And then St. Jerome was there with his quill, you see, and all this kind of thing, and the monks transcribing this across the centuries into what we have now. But anyway, at a certain point, we had to make this genuflection, you see, imitating the monks and so on. I remember grunting and Catholicism, and he said to me like this in Welsh, "Alan Idris, if it weren't for the Catholic Church, you wouldn't be where you are now." In other words, you can't presume that you've just got it right for the first time. He wanted us to get this straight. We've come from somewhere. So coming from a Sunday school teacher, fair play for the man, that was very balanced. And he wanted us to be the same.
Yes.
And one day, I came up to him and I was having serious doubts about the 6th chapter of the Gospel of St. John. And you'll see what I'm saying this in a moment. The scripture itself seemed to be pointing to the Catholic interpretation of itself,
yes,
with regard to what the Lord meant when he said, "This is my body." Yes. And remember that Luther himself banged the table one time with theologians around him. "Hoc est corpus meum." This is my body. He would not tolerate other things, although he had a doctrine of his own. But anyway, he said to me, quietly, this time not raising his voice with anything, he said in Welsh, "Wow, the experts think and say that all this chapter of St. John is referring to the Eucharist." Wow. I thought, that's hot stuff coming from a Baptist Sunday school teacher.
Yes.
He was able to recognise that himself.
Mm.
So it wasn't much longer after that before I started going to see Catholic priests. I remember some time later, perhaps years later, he went to my mother and said in Welsh, "If Ali hadn't been taking so seriously the things I was saying in class, he wouldn't be where he is now." In other words, the words said to a child or to anyone who's genuinely looking for the truth, words have a huge power. Why? If there is genuine wanting to know. The problem is that if we know it already, a word is hitting a brick wall. And that's the problem. Because if you try to dialogue with people who have not thought it out or are afraid to affront the issue in all its dynamics, you'll find that brick wall. Don't insist. But once you find, now this is the point, once doubt comes and genuine seeking and genuine questioning, then it's quite different. Quite different. So the Council handles in this sense the issue of belonging mystically to the source of grace and to its channel, the Catholic Church, comes into it by the fact that grace is working, of course, in these people who are praying genuinely adoring according to the modalities that they have, but they are virtually gravitating towards, as long as they are genuinely in love with Christ. And of course in the beyond, there it will happen. No one will be in heaven, in the beatific vision, who is not at that point also englobed within the mystical body, and therefore participating fully in the means of grace got to him there where he was. And by the way, you have evidence of this if you go, well, it wouldn't be so much your case, at least there are, perhaps you younger ones, there are quite a few YouTubes of people who have had near-death experiences. Oh, yes. People who have died and come back, and a lot of them, some of them would be Catholics, but some of them, or would have become, some of them might actually come to Catholics because these things quite at the other end start to change. But they would quite often be going, if they're not prepared, they go not where people think they're going. If they've been living lives which aren't at all according to the will of God, and they've been really messing up things badly, they're going down. And something in some of these YouTubes is very interesting. What happens is this: there is something going on, they're given another chance because of one tiny spark. Either someone else alive has meditated for them or prayed for them, or a mother or something like that, or they've just done some prayer while they were dying. But always what comes into these is that it's through Christ Jesus, it's through Calvary. Do you see what I'm getting at? Therefore, that's the link already, even scientifically you can see it in these, that there is there proof. It's always through, and you've got actually in Islam, you've got some YouTubes there in the Islamic world coming into it. The people have gone into the beyond and so on, and they've actually encountered the Christian Christ. And the conversions there on YouTube, people actually, that's interesting, because that's showing, you see, that there, to anticipate what I was going to say, that when you get further away, the Jews, who have the same monotheistic basis, and then the Islamic bloc, which again has the God of Abraham, how they, if they're going in the same positive direction of trying to please God and love Him, and they are quite often, look at the devotion of Orthodox Jews and so on, and then Orthodox Muslims, in their culture where it's not aggressive or trying to demolish, but actually in their culture where the problem doesn't pose itself massively. If they're born into a culture, they carry on. But there are degrees of fidelity within their own thing. Therefore, the Lord takes that into consideration and tries His best to make it in such a way that they can be also, they drawn into the mystery of redemption, which without knowing it, they're trying to acquire and orientate themselves towards, because it's all towards God and therefore the salvation of their souls. And by the way, I was told, I haven't been able to verify it, but I was told by more than one person that in fairly recent years there had been a case in Medjugorje where there was this question in the air, well, who's the kind of most holy person around here? And our Blessed Lady, apparently, this is going back I think a good few years now, it seems that she responded to these young people who were puzzled, because in that area, especially in the beginning, there was a lot of different sorts of people. It's an area of different cultures, the Medjugorje. Apparently that she is reported to have said something to this effect, that right now the person around here who's closest to God and most faithful is actually a hidden Muslim mother of a family. Now you see, if that is true, and I haven't been able to verify, but if it's true, it's indicating, you see, that heaven has another vision of things. And what seems also to be certainly true is that Our Lady, I read this, it's actually in print there, that with regard to the way that we look at things, heaven is not always amused by the way that we tend to be happy about divisions and superiority, that her language goes in this direction. The Lord Jesus, her Son, leads all these followers as a king leads his army. In other words, we're all fighting the same battle against the real enemy, Satan. Yeah. And that heaven was not too happy about the way that we're too keen on insisting on the fact that we're better than others and so on. It's not quite like that in God's eyes. There's a superiority in the objective field of truth and the will of the Lord. But then you see there's the mystical element of those, e.g. perhaps brethren of ours, who are way beyond the pale as regards the structures of the church, but giving all their life to sincere evangelization, prayer meetings, and so on, with something which would put us to shame if one compares certain things, because one can't get away from it. They are faithful often to the grace that they have. Now, do you see what that's saying? It's saying this, that they can actually be closer to the heart on the mystical level of Christ and of the church than many a Catholic who's playing his own game with regard to cafeteria Catholicism and actually in a state of grave sin. Even though physically they may be receiving the Lord and Holy Communion, if they're not actually loving and obeying Him materially, they are not actually doing His will. Whereas others who have less light might be actually more pleasing to him, and perhaps able then, if they carry on in that direction, because it's bound to automatically gravitate towards, and it will in heaven of course, lead then to a fullness of light. Now, by the way, that leads to another question. What happens if then this question raises itself? I remember discussing this in class in theology in France, because the lecturer that we had, he was a monk, a very holy monk, still alive actually, but he was one of the great brains of the order, and he was very balanced. And he said, if the doubt arises, il faut lever le doute, one has to raise the doubt, one has to lift the doubt, negotiate the doubt. One can't leave it there. And the whole drama of Newman is that. You can see it working itself out in the essay, so-called, actually a book, on the development of Christian doctrine. You can see step by step how in Anglican writing it, he can't get away from the issue. And he sees it by the end. He finishes it still an Anglican, but then of course he has to go. He sees where it's leading. If what I've said is right, then I can't avoid the issue. The truth is there. Now, if at that point, and that's why after that Newman could not become anything but a Catholic and save his soul, he says, because the new question at that point was, can I remain an Anglican and save my soul? Because then this new element of the light actually hitting him has a responsibility on the part of the individual. You can't then play with your thing. If you can see it, then you've got to go through with it.
Yes, yes.
And therefore we have no right to judge these our brethren, because they may be far more faithful to the amount of light that they have. And the only thing is that there's something quite often not quite right, because when, as I say, one starts to dialogue with them, one finds an aggressive attitude and a harshness which is not that of Christ. One wants to know why. Why are they so afraid of, e.g., the Catholic Church? There's something not normal there. Because I remember actually having to face that issue way back at the age of 13, 14. I remember going into a Catholic church and I realized, both on the level of feeling almost a presence and of the issue of the things I've been reading, that there is greater than I. I have to kneel. It was something, but it was also on the level of the reason, but it was coupled also with the element of grace in the air. Because say what you like, a Protestant in a state of grace, I say,
yes,
does feel it. There's something in the air.
yes.
And I've heard it from quite a few. They can feel it if they're in a state of grace and receptivity. People who go and they know that there's something there, that thing there, that box, they can feel it.
Yes.
And I remember eventually when I'd get off the bus going from school home, I would sometimes, just without telling my parents, drift towards the Catholic church, which was sort of not far from the bus stop. It was always open, even in suburban Cardiff, and there was something which would draw me. In those days it was still unchanged, it was still immediately after the council, and the high altar was still there, and the tabernacle was in the middle, and the 6 candlesticks, but I could sense there was something there. And actually our Sunday school teacher, even though he was a Baptist, he had explained to us, while taking us to a Catholic church, the cathedral in Cardiff, he explained to us what that was up there. He explained that the Catholics, they believe, once the words have been said, this is my body, it does not change back afterwards. Therefore the logical consequence was, but it's still there. Wow! That hits one when one realizes what the real presence means and how the Catholics approach it. Having said that, you've got the closest circuit to us, the Anglicans, and they have all the trimmings quite often, but it's very sad because the High Anglicans give all, and even worship to the Blessed Sacrament, which is not the Blessed Sacrament, more than we do quite often, with all the trimmings, but it's only a piece of bread. Therefore it's material but not formal idolatry in their case. But we can't kneel with them.
No.
We can't kneel with them. I remember my spiritual father, Don Lawrence, explaining that to me, that he could not, it would not be right to kneel in their case if we're Catholics.
Yes, yes.
It's actually idolatry in that case. Anyway, then one gets further, you've got Jews and then Muslims, but then you've got further away, outside the circuit of the sons of Abraham, if you like, monotheistic faith, those who are going back to something more ancient than Christianity. Now you've got these ancient cultures. I mean, let's face it, China, India, Tibet, there's an unbroken line, something very, very ancient there, and they've got their own monks and experts and philosophers, and they've got a culture which one has to reckon to be a force, which is nevertheless sanctified quite a few. I mean, people living in icebergs, that kind of thing, I mean, you have to reckon with the fact that nevertheless there's something there. Therefore, one does not get into the way in which grace works. One does not, as an immature person who knows it all, say, oh, they're all going down under. why? The Lord is trying his best, and it's quite surprising that to find this actually coming through in Lumen Gentium, remembering the documents in the past. And that's, by the way, why partly we have this big theological dialogue going on now with those who are coming out from the Lefebvrist breakaway, the traditionalists, the antichrists in France, that there is this element there. It's not just a liturgical thing, but a theological thing, because they're very keen on the doctrines and the actual proclamations and documents that came out of earlier centuries which go in this direction, presuming, you see, that's the way it was handled, because it was a very literal interpretation that they actually meant being a Roman Catholic in practice, or Eastern Orthodox. But anyway, what Lumen Gentium itself goes into is this, that the further these concentric circles go from the centre, the more difficult it is to understand how it works. Basically, that's my own wording. Yet, we stand back and, in hope and respect, presume and hope that the Lord is doing all that he can within these circles, always further away, to make it possible that they gravitate towards Calvary and therefore can be mystically associated with the power and merit of the Church. Therefore, in some way, that the Church extends its arms. Please come on board, even though you don't understand it, because we want you. So that's the attitude always. We're all on this side of the grave in a mess. Therefore, essentially, that's why, with regard to our thing, we have to be clear. It's not in any way pride, presumption, or arrogance. The truth is something that we have as a precious jewel, but we have it. We have it only, however, within the official parameters. Not more, not less. There's a certain liberty of interpretation with regard to the schools of theology and so on, but certain things remain. I'll just finish with a tiny anecdote. This week we were in this retreat there, and most of the speakers were actually involved in hand-to-hand combat with the devil. There were top exorcists giving us lectures on the spiritual combat, and it's far more serious than one realises. They were talking about everything, including Halloween, by the way, and they went into some detail about Halloween. Yeah. And there's more to it than meets the eye. And these were happening in different languages. There were people all on the same wavelength, but people of great quality and to be respected in their circuits, and indeed in the whole church. And they were coming out with things which make one's hair stand on end with regard to this question of being on the front line and being in a mess. One of the ways in which the devil is trying to get his own is precisely by the fact that now he's managed to weaken the faith, weaken the knowledge of the faith and its proclamation. People are not hearing things. Therefore, that doesn't lead to an absence of anything at all. It leads to an increase of belief, but in wrong things. It leads to superstition, credibility, credulity. People who take on things and hear it's right. Therefore, you get syncretism coming in. New Age, and the worst, of course, is direct Satanism, occultism, but New Age is already the open door to it. Without knowing it, they're invoking angels, but they're fallen angels, and they're harming seriously the soul, especially if those souls are in a state of grave sin already. There's no immune system. Yes. Therefore, all this is stuff, quite often, for exorcism, or at least deliverance. There's stuff in there. And then you've got all the question of curses and so on. People add to it. Now, things which came out in the course of this week were quite surprising. One is the way in which there is a parallel between our great feasts and the feasts of Satanists. And the certain high points for, especially around different parts of the year, one of which would be Halloween, but there are others too, in which things happen on a higher level and degree. Hosts disappear and are abused gravely and so on. There's a lot of evil going on. Certain times of the 24-hour, the actual period, the reverse of Calvary between 12 and 3 in the day, that happens at night. The crescendo is between 12 and 3 at night. Bad things going on, satanic things. Now, with regard to the way in which the devil is handled, in exorcism, quite often things come out. Because remember, the devil also is a creature, therefore he has to obey. He has to obey his king. Christ the high priest is present in the exorcist, who is configured to Christ the high priest. And the devil, with all kinds of grunts and swearing and all the rest of it, will actually have to obey. And he does, even against his wish, come out with things that he doesn't want. And they were coming out with quite interesting declarations of things that they and others had picked up with regard to things the devil actually said, which would be quite unexpected. The power of the Holy Rosary is something else. You wouldn't imagine. And they were able to pick up in different exorcisms things the devil had said about the Holy Rosary. It's an extremely powerful weapon, arm. And every Hail Mary well prayed, and all these mysteries, because they're making him aware all the time of what has been his conquering, are each time extremely damaging to his kingdom. Therefore, what's he doing? Get the Rosary out of the hands of the Catholics. Get the Rosary out of the home. Put the television in its place. Make it outmoded. No. John Paul II was fully aware of the power of the Rosary. And he would himself pray the Rosary with the people of Rome, students and seminarians especially. You could go there without a ticket on a Saturday evening, at least once a month, the Vatican. But he was praying with us. And with regard to other things, there is a whole arsenal that we have of fighting him. All these sacramentals, they're not just objects. Holy water is extremely powerful. The Blessed Sacrament is something else. But all these weapons that we have, if they are used properly, all are extremely powerful against the weapons of the other one. Take away the crucifixes from the walls of the houses, take away even actually the corpus from the, make it just a simple cross, it's less powerful. But take away the cross and crucifix altogether, of course it's not just politically correct, it's something which takes away the barrage of defence. And the big way in which he is conquering humanity right now, you know what it is, don't you? It's purity, impurity. Everywhere it's a complete rebellion against the order of things, because the body and all that goes with it is sacred, but in context and for its purpose, the theology of the body of John Paul II and so on. But out of context, it is an insult to its creator and leads to a complete obnubilation of the reason by passion, because the mind does not reason when out of control. And when does it get out of control? Either by substances, alcohol or worse, or by passions. Therefore it justifies things and it is no longer responsible. But a person who's like a zombie as regards his capacity to organise his life is prime target for the powers of hell. Therefore, do you see why right now the whole element is part of a wider context? We need to know the facts. We need to know how to handle our artillery. Our artillery are the means of grace that we have, and to know the instructions. The instructions are in the documents of the Church, essentially the Catechism, which refers to the documents of Vatican II and all the other councils. I conclude. Where are we at in this? Well, precisely on the front line. Why is the devil so busy in contemplative monasteries, emptying them and making them weak, so that he can take away the barrage of defence? Look at the past. All these monasteries hidden away, all these hidden nuns and monks who were doing nothing else but adoring and doing penance, and quite severe penance quite often, when all that got whittled away, made weaker, bit by bit, not straight away, but bit by bit, and ended up with something which is very attractive, but much less dynamic. What happened? You have the lack of balance. Because in the world there is a balance between good and evil, sin and grace. And if it goes out of balance, what happens? Something has to re-establish it. And we have that message from our Blessed Lady in a different way, but it's there in Fatima. It's there quite clearly in 1917. The secrets do talk about that. If another war will break out, a worse one, and so on, it's there indicating, and if these people were going into hell, they showed them hell, these little children who were horrified, to show where people went, because a lot of people were lost in the First World War apparently. Because there was no one there, why? To do penance, or to make a sacrifice for them, to pray for them. Therefore, we have a power over the world. Sacrifice and prayer, and that means sacrifice and prayer, is something which brings back the balance. Therefore, we are on the front line. We're not just tucked in a corner saying our prayers. We're fighting Satan. It's big time stuff. The whole of our affair is extremely important, even if one is getting on in time. We're not all yet past it, and it's important that we use every moment that we have, because as time goes on, pains will increase, not decrease. It's all matter for victimhood. Use every grain of pain, even moral pain, frustration, not being able to walk properly or whatever it might be. It's all merit, if and only if we love. And then we hand over. Yes. The Lord will take care of it.
Thank you.